click record then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it recording now? Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it is. So should I just start by asking you, I think one of the biggest questions that I have in mind, given that I deal with, or I have done dealt in the past with both the European response to people from the East and also the opposite, the contrapuntal approach that you mentioned in our email exchange. So given this difference between what Orientalism describes as the dominance relations between East and West, between that time and the period that you are working on, and even earlier, which I am working on, which Geraldine Hing works on. I was curious to ask you how productive or applicable you find that definition of race as dominance and also as totalizing dominance, in the sense that you control all the possibilities of thinking and of acting, including practices, law, administration, literary production. And how do you think about racing and race formation in the period that you work on in relation to that difference in the power dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, my work specifically goes to race from queer perspective, right? I work on sexuality mainly, and I started in my dissertation to work on specifically sexuality and sexual encounters in literary imaginations between England and Ottoman Empire, right? But when I studied sexuality, especially looking at the sexual difference, no matter where I go, race appears. Because human desire and human difference are not that much inseparable. And especially that led me to trace sexuality and race relation, or a genealogy of that relation, as it intersects with the history of colonialism and imperial practices, religious difference, as well as gendered erotic hierarchies. But then besides exploring a history of race and what race looked like in the period, in a way, I think what Hang's work makes it possible for me is to think race as an analytics, right? Thinking about human desire together with human difference, both trans-historically and trans-regionally, right? I mean, Hang is specifically looking at the European context, but I want to look at more kind of like the trans-regional relations and dynamics, without really neglecting socio-political or cultural specificities, as Michael Gomez kind of like does the race work, right? Thinking always trans-regionally and trans-historically. But I'm not sure Hang is really just suggesting race is about dominance, because the definition, even much cited since the book came out, definition of race that she uses race as a kind of like as a structural relationship between both the articulation and management of human difference, and not a substantive content. So I think the articulation part really speaks to me to think about race as an analytics when I am looking at the human difference. In that sense, when we are looking at the racialization of the Ottomans in England or Europeans in Ottoman Empire, there is a dominance and power dynamic. But you're right, like Ottoman Empire is a superpower of the power, right, of the period, whereas England is not. And as Dan Wittges earlier suggested, the way England was colonized, or kind of like was under the danger of being colonized when interacting with Mediterranean or East, but they become colonizer when they are interacting with the Americas, right? But the Ottomans or Muslims were not the only others that England racialized or produced a racialized language, right? We have Welsh, we have Irish, that earlier contributed to this race making in England, that then kind of like projected over kind of like the indigenous groups in Americas, as well as even before that on Black Africans and Blackamoors, or the concept of Moor, that North Africans or Muslims. So in that sense, maybe the power dominance being a part of that is important, of course, but what I'm recently thinking, what about when a country or culture feels vulnerable? Then they produce a racialized language more intensively. And when we are looking at the early modern period and post-Reformation, England is pretty much isolated, right, from the Catholic League. And that pushed them to have intense encounters or relations in Mediterranean, especially with the Ottomans. So in that sense, feeling isolated contributes to intensification of discourses that others, not only Catholics, but Ottomans, right? The Ottoman Sultan and the Pope appears the Antichrist. They are the enemy together. To bring their English nationhood together and building that nationhood, the racialization becomes intensified. So it's not only when a country dominates or become powerful that race mechanism works, but sometimes when they are vulnerable. It also happens when we see historically as a kind of defense mechanism to control. So like dominance part is important, but as I said, mainly I am more interested in like the co-productions of race in both contexts and how encounters contributes to that.
Yeah, so it's about the articulation of difference, as you say. But of course, one of the major concepts that Hing introduces is hierarchization of difference. It's not just difference, but the value judgments attached to various. And because she uses the Jews as her case study, as she calls it her benchmark case study, that is why I associate race formation with people who are dominant. Because that's why, I mean, that's the whole point of hierarchization. You want to establish yourself as the dominant force, which is able to therefore colonize and create a logic that other people cannot escape from, that kind of discourse. And so that's my problem, because as we all have noticed, I mean, the Ottomans at that period, and even before in the Abbasid cases and even between, were much more, well, not necessarily advanced as it were, but they had larger population centers. They had large, I mean, there was a greater efflorescence of the arts and architecture and culture and all those kinds, and the economy and those kinds of things. And so that's where the nub of the issue is, I think, for me, which is that the hierarchization and the dominance that implies and how that interacts with the kind of anxieties that you have just described. Because sure, people put up barriers and they start imagining things as a kind of wish fulfillment when precisely they have wishes to fulfill. And they feel a sense of threat. And this has always been, I mean, it's for in various cases, in various places and times in history, there's always been a kind of trigger for more hardened kind of discourses against an outsider or an imagined internal enemy.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there is definitely dominance, but also I think what I am trying to evoke is we have to think this dominance or narrative dominance is also can be a fiction. You don't have to be powerful or dominant to produce the fiction that you are more powerful, you are superior, right? England of medieval period is not superior to any countries we are thinking about the continental Europe and especially Islamic world, right? But the production of race and racism is usually kind of like is projected on an imagined other. So you don't have to be a superpower to be a racist. This is the case study, right? When they are racializing Southeast Indians or Mughals or Ottomans or Islamic world. I mean, yeah, this world is more powerful, but the imagination of whiteness as the superior, imagination of Christian identity as the superior, imagination of uncircumcised body being superior to circumcised, marked bodies, be it Jewish or Muslim, is kind of like this fantasy of dominance, right? In that sense, this is why I think you do not necessarily have to be a superpower to be a racist society, and this is why I think it's really worthwhile. It's worth thinking like, what is it that in a culture that enables such hierarchization? Because definitely hierarchization is an element of race and race making, definitely. But what is it? Is it religious culture? Is it some other cultural elements? Is it language? Right? This is or some political scientists or economy theorists is economy, right? I mean, these are all kind of like kind of theories, whereas I find myself more as a literature student in more in the realm of cultural, the impact of culture and how culture enables such hierarchizations and imaginations of yourself as superior and dominant.
Yeah, which actually opens up very interesting questions about how people who are perceived to be erased themselves may partake in race making and race formation. And that goes some way to establish some kind of recovery, but a kind of Pyrrhic victory, a kind of tainted recovery, because we are not saying that race formation is a good thing in this case because of the value-laden judgments that lead on from hierarchization. And which is where I think opens up all sorts of different interesting possibilities that you actually don't seem to, in your work, want to take the bait. I think in one of your essays you talk about not wanting to recenter the focus on you don't want to go into Ottoman centrism. That's not the point of your work, because you're just replacing one centrism with another centrism. And actually, if we apply this racialization and race making framework and say that, oh, actually, not only were the English capable of race formation and discrimination, but so are the Ottomans. And so that, I mean, in my mind, that would have been an interesting thing to explore as well, to kind of see what's common about race formation in different aspects from different vantage points. And that might be something I'll explore in my work. But in your work, I found something that's really interesting. I mean, the interesting thing that I found in your work was about the emphasis on connection and exchange and a mutually constitutive relationship rather than a mutually oppositional relationship, which definitely existed, but you want to focus more on the mutually constitutive side. So I would just like to ask how that, that fits in or doesn't fit in with kind of race as domination and hierarchization dynamic that we've just been talking about.
I mean, I would say my stress on connections and similarities is mainly stemmed from my reaction to modern racialization that created and separated East from West, and specifically say created Oriental languages and Occidental languages and literatures. So I suggest that nation state or single nation, single language based approach to literature, especially the separation of Islamic literature from, say, Christian or European literature, is an Orientalist taxonomy. So while Orientalist literature and scholars, for example, saw connections between medieval, Christian, or European literary imagination and Islamic world, their suggestion was that Europe has this spirit of Renaissance, right? Suddenly they moved towards reason and secularism, whereas Islamic literature remained in the medieval. They are imprisoned in this backward condition. And I'm talking about 19th century Orientalists like Gibbs, who pushed or kind of Ottoman studies into this medieval world in that sense. And Western literatures are enlightened. And this 19th century is when actually we have the idea that Western literature and imagination is incompatible with these Oriental ones, because Oriental ones are in the backward, and there are no connections in the Renaissance between the cultures. Right, so I started by challenging this by bringing Ottomans, because at the end of the day, I am not an Ottomanist. I am a scholar of English early modernity. But what I do, I look at that literature via the Ottomans to challenge this kind of strict separation, and looking at literature from a kind of nation state-based single language perspective, which early modern literature, which is a literature of appropriations and translations and intertextuality and everything, actually resist this. But it became such a norm in English studies. When I studied, Turks or Ottomans only appeared as the other and serving to have English identities established, English nationalities established. And I'm just like, what if we just look at English literature from Istanbul? What would happen? Right? And this was a challenge to actually this racialization of literary studies and compartmentalization in scholarship that still goes on in contemporary studies, the way we study. It's totally fine to read English sources with French, with Italian, but it's not okay reading English sources with Arabic and Ottoman. You have to justify why you are doing it, because they are different languages. And I'm just like, what is that stress on difference? Otherwise, if we focus on some of the parallels and similarities, we will see a world that has more exchanges, not only in goods, but in ideas, in people, and in practices, and in discursive formations, right? And of course, I'm building on Sarah Mayer's work on medieval French lesbianism in relation to Arabic sources and lesbianism, or Walter Andrews and Mehmet Kalpaklı's studies of Ottoman sexuality in relation to Italian and English sexualities. But what they did, what I call contrapuntal approach, just putting these literatures together and see the borrowings and the tropes, is kind of like really fundamental, or was fundamental, the way I came to focus on connections and similarities. But how my work departs from them is I am also very careful not to be celebratory of that kind of globalism by focusing on the exchange of nice things, but I want to stress the exchange of not so much fun things. What about this exchange of or circulation of, or parallels in sexual discourses, for example, has anything to do with the exchanging discourses about race, about slavery, about colonial practices? So what Mignol would call the darker side of this Renaissance is important, that I want to bring. And you are right, like I am very careful in my work in a way to not to idealize the Ottoman Empire and practices the way many scholars are doing, by kind of setting them apart from the race making or colonialism in Europe and Islamic world in a way, you know, I really appreciate, because the care comes from not to really serve the Islamophobic discourses in that sense. But at the same time, as historians or literary historians, we also have to make sure, sometimes creating a nostalgic, idealized Islamic past or Ottoman past can serve really to bad politics and nationalism or cultural nativism in these spaces as well. So, I mean, in the essays, you see, like in some of the, like in my essay on Black eunuchs or the essay on abduction of the boys, I evoke the historical practices and materiality as probable contributions or probable elements shaping, say, the appearance of eunuchs on English stage, or appearance of abducted boys in English literature. They may be informed, but overall, my project is not actually tracing the similarities and direct borrowings. I think this is just a project that awaits for the future. What I do, I just like read Ottoman and English texts together contrapuntally. Ottoman Empire as the largest empire, one of the most super powerful in the period, an Islamic empire. English as an emerging empire. What happens when I just read the sources together, and what do I see when I focus on the figure of the kind of the other exotic boy in both literature, right? And this is in a way kind of like my contrapuntal method to see the way sexuality and race and slavery and religious difference are operating together in both contexts, without focusing on kind of like direct borrowings of influences or such stuff.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting that you say that, because actually I understood from your essays that you were tracing some kind of influences, and the hinge on which the influences travel is the travel narrative, the travelogue, because you map out certain practices that existed in the Ottoman Empire, which were observed, so slavery or eunuchism, or so mainly those two, I think. And you map those things, those practices, onto what European travelers, actually mainly English travelers, I think in your essays, English travelers have seen, and then they wrote about it, they fantasize about it, they embellish it, and that kind of gets absorbed, or it becomes part of the English literary imaginary. Am I saying that right? So
no, definitely, yeah.
So that's, in my mind, actually, that kind of influence is one of the biggest conceptual leaps, actually, because at every stage there is no, whatever we can call evidence. I mean, I've been repeatedly challenged on this in class about the historical positivism that demands evidence. And what is evidence? What constitutes evidence? Can we talk about critical fabulation? Can we talk about other means, other epistemological bases for making claims? But could you explain a little bit more about this hinge, this pivot on which the influence, or not influence, but the exchanges that you see between the Eastern and the Western Mediterranean operated?
Well, I hope you use the leap in a positive sense, the conceptual leap by tracing the similarities. But I mean, you're right. Like in that essay, you are talking about the Hero and Leander essay. I talk about how travel narratives are constantly writing about these abducted boys, and how abducted boys is a part of discourse about the Mediterranean in English writing, and how Marlowe himself in Tamburlaine plays, for example, contributes by representing these abducted boys. And in that context, can we really read the abduction of the beautiful boy Leander in the Mediterranean in this historical context, rather than just simply as a trope coming from Greco-Roman examples? And this is the historical practice that I am suggesting is influential in making poetic imaginary, right? Or on my essay in Black Eunuchs, I am talking about how the enslavement and gendering of Black African boys, and then transformation of them to a new category of eunuch. And all English sources writing about eunuchs to a degree that eunuch becomes equivalent to Blackness.
Yes.
Contributes to representation of eunuchs on English stage, because both abducted boy and the eunuch starts to increasingly appear on English stage after 1580s. This is exactly when England comes to Mediterranean context. This is when we have all this travel narrative. So, but in terms of evidence, it is an interesting question, right? What is your evidence about the direct borrowing? What they directly borrowed? I mean, while these two pieces kind of like present this historical context as evidence, what I meant in my larger book project, this is not my main orientation, right? But at the end of the day, Ottoman and English writers probably did not read one another, right? I doubt Ottomans just read English, English people read Turkish. But we have to remember, English bodies materially entered into the Ottoman lands, where they interacted with the Ottomans, right? They drank at their taverns and coffee houses. They observed their lives and costumes, or they heard their stories and poems, and they saw their performances, their festivals. Most likely they experienced Ottoman bodies intimately, right? So as a result, I think not only Ottoman goods in that sense, but Ottoman voices, stories, ideas infiltrated into England and shaped English imaginaries via travelogues, poems, and plays on public stage, right? In many of these travel narratives, you even find instances where there are like quotations from Turkish language to show them how Turkish language reads, how Turkish language sounds. So all this infiltration, I think, makes it possible for me to think in spite of differences and putative otherness between the two cultures, they demonstrate striking parallels as well, and showing how discourses as well as persons are circulating when we think Mediterranean as a contact zone that enables this. And I do this not only kind of to show this connection, but also in a way to provincialize Eurocentric sexual history, because at the end of the day, I am like looking at the way, what do we see in England when we look at early modern sexualities from a standpoint located in the Ottoman Empire. And this is my point, but specific works on borrowings and influences, the way Sahar Amer does, the tropes. I think this is kind of like another study that I hope someone will take up in future, and maybe I will take up in future. Yeah.
So yeah, I think I'll skip across quite a few questions actually, because we're reaching the end of the 20 minutes, or we have already reached it. But anyway, I just wanted to ask you, since you mentioned quite a lot on different scholars working on the Ottoman lands and Ottomanists specifically. Who are the interlocutors you find most generative for your work, and who are the interlocutors you wish to speak to the most? And I think that's a question that it's a question that people from non-European language departments always face. The relevance of their work to the broader academy understood in a Euro-American sense,
Yeah.
and where the influences come from and what it's in aid of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say either or. I would say both of them are, both Ottoman studies and English studies are my interlocutors. But of course, I have been trained in an English department, right? All my education, training, and scholarship has been mainly located in English studies. But I was lucky enough to have mastery in both English and Turkish, and spend some years to learn Ottoman and engage with Ottoman studies scholars. To a degree, I think what I do is bridging the two fields, right? To put Ottoman studies in conversation with English studies. And both fields have different disciplinary kind of like, practices and methodologies. And sometimes, in scholarship, we love compartmentalizing and we love over specifying and looking at the differences. But I think I am just like bridging them to bring two rooms together to see what happens when we converse with one another. There are stuff Ottomanists can learn from English scholars, and English scholars can definitely learn from Ottomanists. Because when we have these graduate programs or academia shrinking because of the financial burden, it's a luxury to learn multiple languages and pay attention to kind of like, truly do interdisciplinary or cross-cultural works, speaking multiple languages. But one way to do this is coming together and thinking together and do more collaborative work, in a sense, to bring them. So as I said, like I am lucky enough to kind of like train myself like an Ottomanist and be in constant conversation with Ottoman studies scholars and think about the English studies with these sources. And hopefully they are both going to be, following my work. But in terms of who I want to wish to speak, I start speaking to queer scholars and scholars of kind of like cross-cultural encounters. And then race scholars, especially pre-modern critical race studies scholars, and post-colonial studies and gender sexuality studies. So these are mainly my primary audience, because in grad school I was advised, pick one. This is your primary audience, otherwise you will never be able to finish your dissertation. Then you start engaging with other audiences, and it's not easy to keep a balance of having multiple subfields as your primary audience at the same time. So I am just hoping I am doing a job that kind of like my work will speak to multiple subfields at the same time, as well as, since I value history and historical studies so much, I'm just hoping contemporary queer studies as well as contemporary critical race studies in the US, that I am engaging with the idea of critical race studies in the US and benefiting from Black studies perspective a lot, that my work can speak to this as interlocutors as well.
Yeah, I noticed that actually you don't mention the term adab in your works, but it's a very adab perspective, in that anything, almost anything that's written in a certain register is considered adab, i.e. literature or literary writing. And so the point that you make about history, about travelogues, about different kinds of writing that we might not have associated if we were to study English or European literature in the classical sense, in the traditional syllabus, wouldn't have associated with literature at all. You are bringing all these other kinds of archival, or let's say non-fictional or not fictionally intended or half fictionally intended material in conversation with the fictions to establish a kind of broader cultural discourse, between different parts of the Mediterranean.
Yeah, you are definitely right. And I mean, since the new historicism in English studies, I think early modern English studies, approaching literary and non-literary texts together became kind of a norm, or many people are doing. We are totally fine, despite the fact that, of course, mimetic text representations has their own uniqueness, right? Genre or generic kind of like impacts, and you have to pay attention to that as a literary scholar. But at the same time, being trained in queer studies and early modern queer studies and history of sexuality, taught us that sometimes literature can represent something historical the way that historical documents may not be able to. You may not find sexual imaginaries in court documents, right? In other historical texts, but the literature can help us to think about what was possible to imagine in the period, and the way literature and history speak to each other in terms of representing or presenting the sexuality in the period. So I take this queer training, I think, to my reading of any kind of literature, in a sense that essentially I am interested in cultural formations and discursive formation and discourses, rather than really the specifics of a specific genre, etc. Right? This is not the work I am doing. I am more into a big picture kind of guy. And in the big picture, discourses stems not only from non-literary texts or in history, but it stems from imaginaries. It stems from literature. And this is the beauty of studying the literature, right? They speak to the real life, and they go beyond that sometimes and offers alternatives. So by blending the together, and sometimes my use of historical and literary text really seems blurry, and I'm very aware at the moment it does, but I am not really trying to solve that problem and offer a clear picture, because I am not sure whether it's history that shapes literature or literature that shapes history, and it's not an easy question to answer. And I just like leave that moment as blurry as it is, because the past at the end of the day is so messy, and whatever we are making a claim about presenting a clear picture it can be like deceptive at the end of the day. So as scholars, our job is approach it as objectively as possible and as clear as possible, and work as much evidence as we want. But sometimes there are moments where, as you can tell from my Ganymede piece, whether it is the myth of Ganymede that impact historical practices or historical practices impact the rise of Ganymede, I don't have an easy answer. And I accept that. And this is the moment where kind of like you have the kind of teleological cause and effect relation just collapse, and I'm totally fine with that. And this is the moment when historical and the literary become so blended in a way that I am totally fine with this messy blurrance.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.
And